So, Brian, when people think about aging grandparents, aging parents, older
Hmm.
folks, etc., there's kind of a trope of people forgetting where their keys are. The classic Simpsons thing of Grandpa coming in the door and putting his hat on the hook and spinning around, and then just doing that in an endless loop, and then walking out the door again, right? And it's like maybe a little bit funny, but it's a real thing
Hmm.
that causes serious problems for people.
Hmm.
And in common usage, I don't know that there's much distinction between Alzheimer's disease and dementia, right? It's all just kind of
Yeah.
like lumped in together. And people may
Hmm.
understand that there's a little bit of a difference, but I don't think it's super clear. So, what is the distinction between Alzheimer's and dementia?
That's a great starting point. I often hear people say something like, "Yeah, my grandpa, he's got a little bit of dementia, but he's not at the point of Alzheimer's yet."
Oh, got
And
it.
I'm like, that doesn't actually make any sense. So I think we should talk about that. And the way that I like to describe it is dementia is the syndrome. It's the actual, the analogy is like having a fever, right? And Alzheimer's disease is the cause of that syndrome. It's one cause of that syndrome. Okay. So it's the actual disease, like, say, influenza, that leads to that fever. Um, there are a lot of different causes of dementia. Okay, so dementia is when your memory and your thinking problems are so severe that you basically can't live independently anymore. Okay, so that's what dementia is. Alzheimer's disease is actually a disease in the brain that you can see under a microscope. It's these little plaques and tangles, protein misfoldings that build up in your brain and actually kill your neurons, and that's what leads to dementia of the Alzheimer's type. Okay, but there's a lot of different diseases that lead to dementia. Alzheimer's is just the most common one. It's about 60 to 70% of people with dementia have Alzheimer's that contributes to their dementia. There's also strokes that lead to dementia, a little even mini infarcts, as we call them, which are just small problems with your blood vessels in your brain, can add up to causing dementia. There's Lewy bodies, another type of protein buildup in the brain. There's this newly discovered protein. We don't need to go into it too much, but it's called TDP43. That seems to be a lot more prevalent than we're realizing in a lot of people's brains. And all of these things can lead to dementia. Now, the dementia syndrome can be slightly different depending on what type of disease is actually causing your dementia. Alzheimer's disease, the hallmark symptom is memory loss, right? So, the classic, when you think of someone with Alzheimer's, you think of someone who can't remember your name, can't remember, you know, your relationship to them. That's really a hallmark of Alzheimer's. Other types of dementia have behavioral issues that are more prevalent. Motor problems, problems with movement and function, that all can be part of dementia. But the one really interesting thing I'll say, that if you take anything away from this discussion with me, is that we like to put people in these buckets and say, you have Alzheimer's disease, or you have Lewy body dementia, you have frontotemporal dementia, all these different. But it turns out that actually, if you look in the brain of many older people with dementia, they have what's called mixed pathologies. So most people with Alzheimer's disease in their brain have another type of pathology in their brain as well, like strokes or vessel disease, something like that. And it's actually the combination of the two that often leads to putting people over that threshold of memory and thinking problems that leads to dementia. So if you have the same level of plaques and tangles as Alzheimer's in your brain and you don't have anything else, you may not have dementia, right? But then if you have a little mini stroke, it puts you over the top and you develop dementia and you can't care for yourself anymore.
Got it. So just to clarify then, Alzheimer's itself is defined by the presence of the specific plaques and tangles. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. So when people go to the doctor and they get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, what they're actually getting a diagnosis of is dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. And usually we call that the diagnostic categories have changed in recent years, but really the idea is that you have dementia that's probably due to Alzheimer's disease, right? And so it used to be that we couldn't actually confirm that until you died and we did an autopsy. We actually looked in your brain and we could see that you have these plaques and tangles. But the amazing stuff that's happened just since I've been working in the field is these biomarkers. So, people are developing the way to actually see in living people that you have the protein buildup. We call it amyloid and tau protein, which are the two hallmark proteins. Those are the plaques and tangles in the brain through like a PET image scan. So you can put like a radioactive tracer into people's blood and it actually binds with those proteins in people's brains. And you can see a picture of whether they have amyloid or now more recently tau in their brain. People are developing blood biomarkers. I mean, this would be revolutionary. If we could just do a blood draw and tell you that you have Alzheimer's disease in your system from a blood draw, that would be amazing. And we're moving in that direction now.
Totally. Do you know what they would be looking for in the blood as a hallmark?
They'd be looking for amyloid. So
okay, just actually, like straight up the so plaque itself,
look at
just
it
to get to the
in cerebral spinal fluid right now. We can see it, and they're actually looking for like, you have to be incredibly sensitive to be able to detect it in the blood. And I'm not an expert in this, so I can't tell you how it works, but it blows my mind whenever I go to a conference and I see people presenting on it. But it looks like the sensitivity is actually pretty good for some of these. And they're still in the research stage, so don't go to your doctor and ask them for, you're not going to be able to get it right now. It's still years away, but it does look like we're moving in that direction.
Got it. So to kind of circle back to what we were talking about and make sure that this is that I have this correct, right? That Alzheimer's disease itself is a specific form of pathology in the neurons in the brain. Yes. Dementia is a symptom often caused by Alzheimer's disease, but potentially related to multiple different forms of neuronal alterations, let's say, other stuff going on. You mentioned strokes, you mentioned some other incorrect protein pathologies, all that kind of stuff. And when someone finally does experience dementia enough to cause problems for them, it's typically due to an accumulation of different types of damage. Is that more common than not?
That's exactly right. It is more common that people have two or more pathologies in there. Usually it's something in addition to Alzheimer's, for example, although some people have multiple pathologies and don't have any Alzheimer's in their brain, that leads to dementia. Yes, that's exactly right. And then what's really cool, and this is where I actually got really interested in the field, is that, and this is where going to really take things out. It's not just that level of all of those pathologies in your brain. It's also something that we refer to as cognitive reserve capacity. So some people, based on their lifestyle, based on experiences they've had in their life, can actually tolerate more pathology in their brain before they actually experience dementia. So a good example is level of education. So there seems to be this correlation between people who have more education can actually have more of this Alzheimer's and other pathologies in their brain before they actually experience dementia. So it almost is like a reserve capacity that they can draw from and tolerate that pathology building up in their brain and still be able to function for longer before the pathology overwhelms their neuronal systems.
Yeah, for sure. And we mentioned this a bit before we actually started recording, but the analogies to joint injuries in athletes are striking to me here. And I know there's probably quite a few strength and conditioning coaches, CrossFit folks who potentially listen to this. And a lot of those folks probably have some understanding of like, okay, people have back pain, right? Which is like the symptom that they're experiencing. And the reasons for that back pain can be super complicated and potentially multiple different things. Maybe they have some disc degeneration. Maybe they have some altered movement patterns. Maybe they have some, nerve impingement. There's just like all these little pieces that can add together. And similarly, You could, if you take a bunch of healthy people, start scanning their backs and looking what's going on, you have tons of people with no symptoms whatsoever who have backs that look like they shouldn't be able to walk. And, vice versa, you have some folks who are in excruciating back pain and the actual damage to their tissue doesn't seem to correlate in the way that one would expect, right? So it's like, okay, and some folks seem to have this capacity to just tolerate it and other people don't. It's so fascinating.
This reserve capacity idea seems to be found in almost all of the physiologic systems in our body. It's really interesting. Yeah. Absolutely. Heart, liver, and brain as well. And like you're saying, joint pain, back pain. Yeah. And some people, there is just in so many different systems, not a direct correlation between the level of pathology and the amount of syndrome or symptoms that you experience, which is kind of scary, but also kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a positive spin to it, right? Because it means that, even with Alzheimer's, for example, we don't have a cure right now, right? We don't have a drug that I could give you if I know that you have Alzheimer's that's going to stop you from developing these memory and thinking problems that are so severe, over time. But what I can tell you is that there's a way you could live your life more healthily that could potentially delay those symptoms from coming. So if you can buy 5-10 years from being more physically active, more cognitively active, more stimulating your mind more, then that's a way to kind of buffer these problems that may be coming from what we can't actually cure right now. Although hopefully in the future we can cure it, but we're working on that. But as of right now, we don't have that silver bullet, that pill we can give you.
Totally. So there's some known interventions that can increase the reserve capacity that people have. And as a researcher, something that I'm curious about is that with these kinds of multifactorial, like multi-causal situations where there also seems to be a huge variation in something like reserve capacity, it's very, very difficult to get clear interventions and to study what's actually going on. Because, some people seem to be able to just like, you can do anything to them and they're basically fine. And other people are not like that at all. And so, you see that all the time in the literature surrounding pain science, what's the best thing for shoulder rehab? What's the best thing for back rehab? And properly controlling for and adjusting for all these different variables is super, super difficult, right? And so you're obviously looking at this in terms of, population level epidemiology. So I guess I'm curious, like, what do you think is the right level of abstraction to try to figure out what's going on here?
Well, you have a very good point. It's really hard to figure out, and everything we're talking about has implications for how you design clinical trials to see if an intervention actually works to prevent Alzheimer's disease, or if you're designing observational studies like what I do, where you're just like looking at a population and figuring out why there's certain trends, why certain things are correlated with dementia and other things are correlated with less dementia. You have to have this bigger picture, right? You have to understand that it's multifactorial. Otherwise, you're going to have findings that don't make sense. So I'll give you an example. So some optimistic news to report is that over time, it looks like the incidence of Alzheimer's dementia, so that the syndrome of dementia that we think is due to Alzheimer's, seems to be going down over time. Okay. Now the prevalence, this is an epi primer right here. Okay. Prevalence is the proportion of a population that has a disease. Incidence is how many new cases of disease that we have in a certain amount of time. Okay. So the prevalence is going up, right? And the reason the prevalence is going up is because people are getting older. And as people age is the primary risk factor for dementia. And so, the baby boomers are all getting old. So we have this huge segment of the population that are entering that risk stage for Alzheimer's and dementia. So that number is going up over time. That's bad news. But the good news is the incidence. So the number of new cases for any given age group is actually appearing to go down over time. And so the question is why? We don't have any cure for Alzheimer's disease right now. Like, why would the prevalence of dementia due to Alzheimer's, the incidence, be going down over time? Well, I think it turns out to be the fact that, and this is controversial, we're still trying to figure this out, right? But most of the evidence points to the fact that we're doing a better job at controlling cardiovascular disease. We're doing a better job at controlling people's blood pressure, cholesterol, all of that. We're seeing, over the last 3 decades, we've seen, a lot of beneficial impact of these treatments that we're doing and preventative measures for people's heart disease, right? And that has this side effect or this secondary effect of actually leading to less cerebrovascular disease in people's brains. And what did I say in the beginning of this? If you have Alzheimer's disease and you also have cerebrovascular disease, you're more likely to experience the syndrome of Alzheimer's dementia, right? But if we're controlling one and we're not controlling the other, we're still bringing that risk of Alzheimer's dementia down almost inadvertently. Like, we didn't do all of those interventions necessarily for dementia. We did it more for heart disease, but it had this beneficiary secondary effect of bringing the risk of dementia down.
That's fascinating. So just to make sure that I understood that properly, you're basically saying that maybe I'll take a step back and just say,
sure,
there is an element of, as people age, they're probably going to get cardiovascular disease, cancer, and some form of neurodegenerative thing going on, right? There's just like an area under the curve type of situation of like
the risk gets higher as you age.
Yeah. Yes. The longer you've been alive, the more you're going to start to accumulate the type of damage that manifests itself in those ways, right? So it's not surprising at all that, as you said, right, as a large cohort of people and the baby boomers gets older, the absolute prevalence of these types of things
is the absolute increasing. Number is getting bigger and bigger. Right.
Yeah, totally. But simultaneously, due to improvements in cardiovascular health mitigation, right? That the number of these like micro strokes or what have you that actually push people into being symptomatic is resulting in fewer incidences of Alzheimer's within like a cohort. Is that's correct?
Right. That's exactly, you got it perfect. So for an 80-year-old, let's say, your risk of developing Alzheimer's dementia as an 80-year-old is maybe a little bit lower than it was 20 years ago. But there's just a lot more 80-year-olds around now. Right. Yeah. So because of that, if you count the number of people with Alzheimer's dementia, it's going to be a lot larger now than it was 20 years ago. But you as an individual who are 80 years old have a little bit lower risk. So it's good news, bad news, right? It's good news for you as an individual, but it's bad news for us as a society because, it costs, well, first of all, the human tragedy of Alzheimer's obviously is not, you can't even count it, right? But in terms of monetary value, it's a very, very expensive disease for our society that we don't really have the ability to do anything about right now. And as we have more and more people who are suffering for years and years with this disease and this syndrome, we're talking about billions of dollars caring for people before they pass away.
Yeah. And to ask another question just on the changing population dynamics here. So all of this stuff could be happening without let's call it the tendency to accumulate plaque and tangles changing at all, right? That people may be just accumulating the exact same amount, but they're just not experiencing. Right. Yeah.
I have no reason to believe that there's been anything that has changed that your risk of developing those plaques and tangles, because we can't figure out how to stop it, unfortunately. If we could, we would try to lower that risk, and we're working on it. But so that's the bad news is we can't really seem to do anything about the Alzheimer's disease, although, there's stuff in the pipeline that hopefully in our lifetime, we're going to see some major changes in that direction. But the good news is that all these other things that accumulate with it, we do seem to be doing something for. So your overall risk of dementia seems to be going down.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, that's one of those things where I think that, obviously people don't want to be accumulating plaques and tangles. Right. But if the situation is that they have them, but they don't have dementia, I mean, I think that a lot of folks are okay with that kind of thing, right? It's like, okay, I'm developing prostate cancer as an 84-year-old, but like, I don't care. By the time this causes me a problem, I'd have to be 125.
You got it exactly right. So the the unintended consequence of being able to develop these biomarkers that I was talking about and see Alzheimer's disease in people's brain before they actually develop cognitive problems that are very severe is that all of a sudden you've got millions of people that we're going to be telling you have Alzheimer's disease. Okay, you don't. All right, yeah, I know you can remember things right now, but somewhere down the line you may not be able to. And what does that mean for the pharmaceutical industry, for the Medicare, for the health insurance industry? If all of a sudden you have people that have a disease that maybe are eligible for a certain treatment, even though they're not having any actual syndrome. And if you think about it, if you drew like the iceberg analogy, the people with dementia are just the tip of the iceberg, right? They're the people who have gone past the threshold and actually have problems with their memory and thinking that are that severe. But then you've got people with what we call mild cognitive impairment. That's like a lower, and that's like, you're still able to function. You're just having some problems with your memory. And then you've got people who have no symptoms at all at the base of that iceberg. And so all of those people have Alzheimer's disease, right? But who's actually eligible for a treatment once it's available? And who's going to pay for it, right? Is it going to be the 5 or 6 million people with Alzheimer's dementia, or is it going to be the 10 to 20 million people who have Alzheimer's in their brain? I don't know.
Yeah. And depending on what the treatment is, what are the potential side effects or unintended consequences of the treatment? Sure. And then you get into that uncomfortable conversation of like, right. Oh, well, maybe you have Alzheimer's, but the expected value of the treatment based upon where you are is actually negative,
Sure. Although it looks like we think that probably if we're going to develop an effective treatment, you got to start it early, right? So it probably would be those people at the base of because once you actually have Alzheimer's dementia, like, I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of an Alzheimer's brain. Have you ever seen what a brain looks like?
Yeah, I mean, it's my girlfriend is in medical school, so I've seen.
Okay, so you've seen, yeah, I mean, like, you can lose up to a third of your brain size when you have severe Alzheimer's disease. And the thinking is, once someone gets to that point where, your neurons have died off, can you actually bring it back? Can you give is it even realistic to think you can give a treatment to someone and you have to actually grow neurons back and make connections and synaptic connections again. So, the thinking now in the field is we need to intervene before we get to that point. So when someone has Alzheimer's in their brain, but their brain cells haven't started dying off yet, and actually stop that process from happening. So like a secondary prevention model. Yeah. Right? So then that means that millions of people would be eligible for that treatment. And it would be a nice problem to have if we had that treatment. Don't get me wrong, but we would have to figure out as a society how to pay for it.
Yeah, totally. So you started to mention some stuff just about developing reserve capacity that enables people to potentially tolerate, insults to their neurons, like accumulating a few tangles and plaques and all that. What does that look like for folks? Do you have ideas of like, okay, these are the things that we know work, either from like an epidemiological perspective or from like a more randomized controlled trial?
So most of the evidence comes from epidemiology, in terms of observational studies. So we're developing trials. So observational studies are the bread and butter of epidemiologists, and that's when you observe. That's why it's called observational. You observe a population and you see how they're living their life and what they're exposed to, and then you compare it to people who are not exposed to that, and you make these correlations. But you have to adjust for all these reasons that the correlations could be spurious, right, and non-causal, like confounding. Something else could be related to both the exposure and the outcome that's making you think the exposure causes the outcome, but it doesn't actually. It's something else. Reverse causation is a problem where it's actually the outcome you're looking at that's causing the exposure, right? So there's all these threats to causal inference using observational studies. So the gold standard is the idea of a clinical trial. Now, the problem with things like what I'm about to talk about in terms of lifestyle And when I say lifestyle, I should say that a lot of people don't like the term lifestyle because this is an aside, but I think it's important. A lot of people think that it implies choice, like I'm choosing to, eat really healthy, whereas a lot of people don't have that choice because of the context of the lives and where they grow up and the neighborhoods they live in and the opportunities that they have and their income. Okay. So when I say the word lifestyle, I don't necessarily mean only your choice of how you live. I also mean like the context of your life and the situation that you're placed in based on where you were born, in our society. Okay. So keep that in mind, right? So there's all sorts of other ways we could call it besides lifestyle. I'm just going to use the term lifestyle. But anyways, that was an aside. So the point that I'm trying to make though, is if you're designing a clinical trial, it's actually pretty hard to do with something like lifestyle compared to taking a pill. Okay. It's pretty easy. If you're like, I think this pill is going to do something. I'm going to take a group of people, give them the pill, group of people, not give them the pill, or give them a sugar pill, the placebo, and then just compare what happens after people take the pill to the sugar pill, right? Easy. But what do you do if I tell you that education is the intervention? Like, how do you do a trial on education? You could take a bunch of people when they're kids and follow them 80 years and see the people who you randomized to education. There's also ethical issues. You can't randomize people to education versus no education. So it's the same thing with physical activity, social activity, cognitively stimulating activities. All of these things we think have the ability to build up this cognitive reserve capacity. And they're all things that are really hard to study from a clinical trial perspective. Now, we are doing it. There's actually a trial called the Pointer Trial, which is happening all around the world right now. And they're trying to actually take some of these concepts and randomize people to them and say, we're going to ask you to go and be physically active. And then this group, we're going to ask you to be getting social pods and, be social, so we can actually figure out which aspect is the most beneficial. But, then the question is, well, how long do you have to do it? Can you do it for a year and get the benefit? I don't know. Maybe it's a lifetime of being active that really matters, right? So it's hard to know. All these questions come into the study design, and you may have, if you don't look long enough, you may get a null result and then say, hey, actually turns out being physically and socially active doesn't actually do anything for you. Well, maybe being physically and socially active for 6 months doesn't do anything for you. But if you started when you were 50, by the time you turn 75, 80, you would see some big time benefits. It's hard to say. And that's why observational studies are very handy for being able to see that more long-term effect and more real world ways that people live their lives rather than the artificial ways that we randomize people into lifestyle in clinical trials. So there's kind of pros and cons of each ways of doing it. And if you use the combination of the two, you kind of get at some ideas about what might be working.
Yeah, totally. And to that point as well, designing an intervention and trying to test it runs into challenges that we sort of started to touch on earlier too, where it's
Absolutely.
like, okay, what is the intervention for exercise? Is it we give you a pamphlet on how to exercise? Do we make sure you actually go to the gym 3 days a week? Like literally, what are you going to do? And that's not an easy problem to solve.
Do you do cardiovascular? Do you do weightlifting? Do you do a combination of both? Do you do high intensity? Do you do, it's like, I've come to the conclusion in recent years that really it's just doing anything. I mean, people, there's so many questions about what specifically you should do. And I'm like, listen, if you get off your butt and go be active, it's going to have beneficial effects for you. Okay. That's my answer. I mean, I can't tell you which specifically is going to be the best for your brain, but doing something rather than nothing, I can guarantee you will be good for your brain.
Yeah, totally. So to kind of summarize what you're saying, and especially in these kind of very long timeline, difficult to kind of intractable diseases that don't have a simple pill that you can take, that population level epidemiology can give some different insights because you're able to, in very broad strokes over very long timelines, look at behaviors like exercise, nutrition, level of education attained, all that kind of stuff. And that by being clever with the way that you look at that stuff, you can start to shake something out that actually makes sense.
100%. You said it perfectly. And also you can replicate it across lots of different studies, right? So, I mean, there's this whole question about whether all these types of activity lead to cognitive, causally protect you, lead to this cognitive reserve capacity, as opposed to the reverse causation problem, which is like, well, maybe it's just the people who have the brains that are just doing better are more able to be active, right? Like you just are, you've got a good brain. They call it the better brain hypothesis, right? So therefore you're not going to get Alzheimer's, and you're also going to be able to stay physically, socially, and cognitively active, right? And you can't ever say with an observational study, you can design it in a way where you can try to get at that, but you can't 100% write that off. But here's the thing. We've seen this association across 20 different observational studies. It's almost always there. Like whenever you measure it and you look at the people that are the most active, they're the ones who seem to get dementia less. So if you see it so consistently, it's one of the causal criteria that we have. If you very consistently see an association across many different contexts, across many different studies that have adjusted for a whole bunch of different things, it's pretty good evidence that there's something going on there, right?
Yeah, it's one thing to get a spurious correlation or two out of a big data set once or twice, but then once or twice, yeah.
But if you see it everywhere, you're like, I probably believe this is true. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of your papers is more specifically on socializing, potentially helping with this cognitive buffering, let's call it. The talking to other people seems to be helpful in terms of reducing risk of Alzheimer's dementia. Can you just give like a rundown of like what you actually looked at there and why you think it's a robust result?
Yeah, so I should say that this is one of the reasons I got into this line of work, honestly. When I first got into Alzheimer's as like a college student, I was like, Alzheimer's is a very interesting disease. I'm fascinated by it, but like, I don't necessarily want to be studying molecules and, proteins. That's not really my bag, and then I discovered, holy mackerel, people who are more socially active are less likely to get dementia. Like, I mean, so you're telling me going out with my friends and doing what I love to do, being with other people, is actually good for my brain. I found that so intriguing, and I wanted to study that and go forward with that. So the study that you're talking about is with the cohorts from the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center where I work. And we follow people over time. So we do an annual assessment of their cognition. We do this robust battery, ask them all sorts of questions about their memory and their all sorts of different cognitive domains aside from just memory, their visual, spatial ability, their processing speed, all of these things that change over time with aging, but more so with disease like Alzheimer's, right? And you can look and see by testing someone every year, the trajectory of their cognition, right? So on average, most people, unfortunately, when they get to their 80s, and most of the people in these studies are in their 80s, you see them slightly going down on average over time. And what we did is
sorry to interrupt, but I am curious, like, what do those tests actually entail? Is that like the Donald Trump, like person, woman, camera, TV test?
Oh, the Donald Trump test, which he aced. As an aside, that is a screen for cognitive impairment. So if you have a normal level of cognition, you are supposed to get a perfect score on it. Okay. So acing that just means you don't have a cognitive impairment. So for the record, there's no such thing as acing it. You're supposed to ace it. unless if you don't, then we're like, okay, we need to do some further testing because there's something going on here. Anyway, so that is a cognitive screen. That test. It was called the MoCA that he was talking about. And actually the test that we use, so we do Actually, we do a test called the MMSE, and we're switching to the MoCA. But both the MMSE and the MoCA are a screen where, again, they go from like 0 to 30. If you get 26 to 30, you got normal cognition. If you got anything lower than that, we do further testing. So the tests I'm talking about that went into this paper are the further testing. So they're much more in depth. They take hours to do the whole battery of 20 tests, and they really get at a much better distribution of cognitive ability, right? So instead of like everyone lumped over here at 30 and then a few people are doing worse, you actually get like a normal distribution where there's a mean, which is how most people are doing. And then you have people that are doing really well on this tail. And then you got people that are doing really poorly on this tail. And you can actually see how, and then you can do an average of all 19 cognitive tests, right? Which we call a global cognition score. And you can see how that score of global cognition changes over time. And lo and behold, when you look at enough people, over 1,000 people, and you look at enough time, the average does go down over time when people get into their advanced stages. And that's because some people have Alzheimer's disease and these other pathologies in their brain that are starting to affect them, right? So what we did in this study is we had a measure of how socially active people are. So we asked some questions like, how often do you go to museums or other cultural places with your friends? How often do you play bingo with your friends? How often do you volunteer in clubs? Stuff like that. So I don't remember the exact questions off the top of my head, but it was like, say, 8 questions. And we have a number that indicates how socially active you are. And what we did is we took that number from the very first time that you joined our study. All right. So this is part of what we do in observational studies is we establish temporality, right? So if we measure how socially active you are before we look at your cognitive trajectory, then we can know that your cognitive trajectory, 10 years from now didn't affect that score at the beginning of the study. Now, of course, there's a caveat there because it could be that the trajectory we see in the next 10 years is just the result of how you've been doing the 10 years before, right? So there's still the problem that like we're catching people in the middle of the trajectory and it's already affected them pulling back on their social activities, okay? But for the most part, we got rid of anyone who was having any obvious cognitive problems, right? So everyone at the beginning of the study in my analysis had no cognitive problem. So they seemed normal, their cognition was normal. And we measured who was socially active and who wasn't. And the people who were most socially active saw in the following 10 years, their rate of change in their global cognition score was what's the word I'm looking for? Shallower, not as steep as the people who were less socially active. Okay, so if you were less socially active, then you declined at a much faster rate. And we've shown this with all sorts of measures of, we have another measure called life space, which is how far you travel from your house, right? And so you just ask a simple question like, in the last week, did you leave your bedroom? Yep. Okay, did you leave your house? Yes. Okay, did you leave your yard? All the way up to did you leave your town? And we just get a measure of what your life space is like. Unfortunately, for a lot of older people, their life space constricts as they get older, and they just get used to just not leaving their house very much, right? And that simple measure of just leaving your house or leaving your town was related to level of cognitive or rate of cognitive change, as well as incidence of Alzheimer's dementia. So very consistently, we see these measures of activity, of engagement being related to your cognitive trajectories in the coming 10 years of your life.
Yeah, totally. And so you started to touch on it where, I think that the first impulse people might have to criticize something like that is like, well, yeah, people who are doing better, like obviously you're going to feel comfortable going on a trip if you're doing better. Obviously, You're going to feel more comfortable like calling your friends up if you're like, yeah, I still got it. I'm sharp. I can tell jokes. Yeah.
So that's
if
why
you're embarrassed, you're not going to,
Right. So that's why we try to start with, we adjust for that difference, right? So we try to start with a group that are all cognitively pretty similar, right? And we adjust for any kind of baseline differences and anything that we think could be related to why you're seeing these differences, so that we can really see the adjusted rate of change, right? So you can kind of think of it as everyone's kind of starting in the same place, and we got rid of anyone, like obviously someone who's like experiencing the beginning of dementia is probably going to start pulling back from their social activities. So we get rid of them in the analysis, right?
Yeah, totally. And so another question I have on something like this is, you talk about watching out for reverse causation, right? You can like adjust for that. Mm-hmm. Can you just explain quickly the difference between controlling for and adjusting for? Because I think that's something that gets kind of like thrown around, and people, who sort of know what they're talking about, but not totally.
Yeah.
And I'd like to get like a clear picture of what that is.
I'm not sure that I could say that I could say the difference between adjusting for and controlling for, other than one is a statistical procedure and another one is more of a theoretical exercise. Okay, so like when you adjust for something, it just means you put something into the model, right? So that you say you're adjusting for smoking, so that your association that you're estimating from that statistical model is adjusted for smoking, meaning you're looking within categories of non-smoking and smoking, right? Because if smoking was related to the outcome and related to the exposure and you didn't adjust for it, then it would spuriously look like the exposure and the outcome are related, but it's only related because people who smoke do both of those things.
Yeah.
Right? Have the exposure and have the outcome. So then when you adjust for it, you're saying, give me the estimate for people who don't smoke, and then give it to me for people who do smoke, and then average that, right? Or a weighted average based on your prevalence of smoking. Okay, that's what adjusting for means. Controlling for takes it a little further, and it means like you have address the issue of confounding or whatever. Okay. So people conflate the terms, but I think what they mean when they say they controlled for something or is that they adjusted for it statistically, and they are pretty sure that the controlled association is controlling for the effect of that factor that could lead to the spurious association.
Yeah,
if
so
that makes sense.
Yeah, so I'll ask a follow-up question on that. So adjusting is kind of like after the fact, you have the data and you can figure out like, okay, maybe, in this case, for example, I know you mentioned making a bunch of adjustments for things that might, create some issues. And like one would be like personality trait extroversion. We're like, okay, we need to make sure that we're watching out for extroversion as a thing that could create some confusion here, because more extroverted people are probably going to have more social events and independent of like anything else going on with them, right? And then whereas controlling is that baked more into the experimental design itself rather than
controlling? Great question. So controlling again is the larger concept of dealing with a problem to your causal inference. So it can include both adjustment for after the fact, and also what we as epidemiologists like to say is more important is designing the study correctly from the beginning. So before you even gather the data, you're making sure you're doing an apples to apples comparison, and you're actually upfront addressing some of the issues that would lead to the spurious relationships down the line. Right. Yeah. So absolutely right. Controlling for is the bigger picture idea of dealing with a problem, whereas adjusting for means very specifically just the after the fact modeling of things.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
A lot of people use them interchangeably, but you're right that it's not necessary. If there's a Venn diagram, adjustment is only one little piece of controlling for something.
Okay, cool. No, that's very helpful. That's very, very helpful. Cool. And another question I had on that is I guess the idea of like having interest in something, right? Like how does that fit into this model? Because I could see that being something that maybe isn't easily capturable by some of the adjustments you were discussing, but also potentially is causal for both doing better cognitively and socializing more, right? If you imagine someone who's like, I'm interested in baseball, therefore I'm going to like look at baseball statistics and talk to my friends about baseball, maybe even go to a baseball game, right?
Yes.
And it's like, how do you like try to disentangle something like that?
That's a super interesting question. And it comes up all the time. Is it actually doing the activities, or is it actually desiring to do the activities? Right. And this is the problem actually with clinical trials. Or if you think about it, let's say it was actually being interested in social activities that mattered, then you would randomize certain people to being socially active who hated it, like introverts or something. And they, absolutely could detest being social with people, and it wouldn't actually have the benefit that you're looking for, right? So it's a really good question, and it's hard to know how to deal with it. That's why I think you need to use both observational studies as well as randomized clinical trials to kind of hone in on what element is it that's actually meaningful, right? But one thing I will tell you about that is, it's not just like a funny idea. There is something to the psychological concept of wanting or desiring to be involved, to be engaged, that seems to be beneficial to people's brains. So we actually study something called purpose in life. So we just asked a bunch of questions that basically measures whether someone wants to get out of bed in the morning, like how much do they feel like they have a reason to be alive. And I think many of us who are younger may think that's a weird measure, but I think a lot of people who get into their 80s and 90s can really, that resonates with them. I think that,
I think even younger people in COVID,
maybe even some younger people,
right?
Absolutely.
So
I shouldn't even say that. You're right.
People have, yeah.
Unfortunately, this pandemic is really bringing out that question in a lot of us. Like, what reason do I have to get up in the morning? It's very sad, but it has drastic effects on your health, not just your brain health, right? But all sorts of elements of your health. And 100% we're seeing this association between purpose in life and being less likely to develop dementia.
Yeah, totally. And sort of like we were saying earlier, I imagine something like that is also a potential threshold type of situation, right? Where it's like, okay, do you feel like getting up and going? Well, do you have social activities to look forward to? Have you been exercising? Right? Like all these things potentially push you over the edge of like, I do have purpose in life.
Yep. Yeah. Positive feedback loop, right?
Yeah. Totally. Totally. Yeah. And we see that on a smaller scale with folks at the gym, right? Where it's like, once you start doing a few healthy activities, it becomes easier to do other healthy activities. And then they kind of like reinforce each other, where you're like, oh, I actually slept well because I exercised. And now since I slept well, I'm like going to eat less impulsively and I feel better throughout the day. So then I actually want to go to the gym. And it's just like, yeah, good. Those all work together.
Totally. It's all multifactorial, and yep.
makes it
there's so much parallels between physical health and brain health that, our brains are part of our physical system, but like, a lot of people think of, there's this mind body duality, and people think that like what's good for one is different from what's good for, but it seems like what's good for your body is good for your brain. And, it's really one and the same.
Yeah, totally. So I kind of want to zoom out a little bit and talk about epidemiology as a whole, right? I mean, we've been talking about your research, Alzheimer's, and I think some really interesting and insightful stuff there that, at least for me, also clarifies a few things where, I know a few random tidbits, but I'm like, this is a much clearer model. But I mean, you host a podcast about epidemiology. You do a bunch of different work kind of communicating about just how to interpret epidemiology, how to put information out in the world in a way that's actually helpful for people. And today, the day that we're recording this, there's kind of a public news event where the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in the United States has been, declared like, okay, we have to do more study on this because of some blood clots, relatively rare.
6 blood clots.
Yeah. And a few million doses. Right. And so there's some topical interest in like, okay, how do we actually communicate this kind of stuff to people? So I guess from your perspective, I mean, we can even use the Johnson & Johnson vaccine as a jumping off point. Like, how should we communicate these like complicated, difficult, nuanced ideas in a world that, doesn't seem to want to listen to things like that, and seems to very quickly jump to one side or the other, and start attacking each other.
Oh man, we could talk for 2 hours on this. I have so much to say about this. I mean, the first thing I thought of, and most epidemiologists probably thought of when they saw the news today, is, oh great, now everyone's going to think these vaccines are not safe. We've already got all this vaccine hesitancy, and now people are going to freak out and say, I'm not getting that vaccine, right? And unfortunately, the flip side of that is, if you think about it, what people should be thinking is, wow, they're being so extra cautious that these 6 rare blood clots in 7 million doses made them pause everything to make sure this is, as safe as possible. That should tell you that these are really safe vaccines, right? If this is the biggest issue we've seen is these 6 blood clots, and the sad thing is people don't understand the history of medical interventions. Like, if you could see, if you were trained like I was, I went to 5 years of an epidemiology program, and I learned a lot of this history, and you would then know that these are some of the safest, not just vaccines, but medical interventions we've developed in medical history, right? Really, like it's shocking and so fast. And, so rarely have we come up with a magic bullet, a silver bullet like this so quickly for such a major problem. I mean, we just talked for 45 minutes about Alzheimer's disease. We've been looking for decades for something like this. And here we go. We have this pandemic for 1 year, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, we got a vaccine, and it's basically 100% effective, and it really doesn't seem to have a lot of side effects. Like, okay, sign me up, right? Give me that thing. But unfortunately, the messaging is very scare tactic-y. I believe that the media, I have to be careful here because I don't want to vilify the media, but I unfortunately do think that a lot of the ways that many things in this pandemic have been reported is, if you only focus on the risk and the negative aspects, that's all people are going to see. That's all they're going to hear, right? There's not a story that says, 6,999,000 whatever doses given without a blood clot. No, it's six blood clots. And it's like, oh my gosh, this vaccine gives me blood clot, I'm not taking it. So it's really, really difficult to convey risk appropriately to people in a way that they can get and they can embody and understand. And it's something that we struggle with in public health, big time. And unfortunately, if you only focus on the negative, you're gonna have people thinking that. And then, of course, I don't want to get too much into this, but then you've also got people giving so much disinformation out there. I mean, for every actual study result you see, you got some Joe Schmo on Twitter telling you complete nonsense that is not based on facts. So there you've got the issue of disinformation and how people can know what a trusted source is versus a non-trusted source. So that's a big problem too.
Yeah, well, I think the latter is a really interesting thing. I mean, you especially see this on Twitter, where you very clearly have people who are extremely intelligent and like really know what they're talking about, kind of, but then they start digging around in data and finding like anomalies that sort of don't make sense, but actually do if you understand the bigger picture. But they can weave these very plausible sounding arguments that also seem very technical because they do kind of know what they're doing, like in some ways, right? And I think that's a very challenging, issue to deal with, right? Because it's like, okay, if you're not well versed in the totality of the literature of this specific topic, and someone has a very plausible sounding argument with data to back it up, and kind of has this narrative of like, see, the elites are out to get you, like, because they're not showing you this thing, and like that's tough. Like I don't know how you circumvent that.
I'm trying to figure it out, honestly. A lot of us are trying to figure it out. I mean, I think you just have to be as honest as possible, and you have to. I mean, another major problem is like we make mistakes, I mean, totally. And part of science is making mistakes and correcting mistakes. And unfortunately, it seems like we've gotten to the point where like if you make a mistake, then everything you say is is worthless, right? I mean, a big example is Fauci, at the beginning of the pandemic, saying that, some stuff about masks not being effective, right? He's since come to say, I've erred. That was a big mistake. We should have started everyone with masks earlier. But unfortunately, it sticks with him. It sticks with the public health messaging, and people take that to say, why should I believe anything? Like, why should I wear a mask now? You said it wasn't effective before. Now you say it's effective. Well, things evolve. Our viewpoints evolve. We get more data, we get more information, and we rectify mistakes we made in the past. There's not a lot of room for making those mistakes and fixing them in this day and age. And the Johnson & Johnson example is a perfect one. I think they're being very overly cautious in my mind. And I think it may have more of a negative effect because of what we're talking about, because people will take the message to be this vaccine is not safe. But in a vacuum, what they're doing is the right thing to do, right? It's like, oh, we've got some evidence that there may be a problem here. Let's pause everything, be conservative, and actually check to see if this is actually causing a problem in people. So again, if you saw that and you knew that and you trusted that was why they were doing it, you'd say, awesome, I trust them to do this, and let's hear what they have to say. And then if they resume it again, I'll get that Johnson & Johnson shot. But a lot of people aren't going to go there, right? They're just going to say, off the table now. I don't believe in this anymore.
Yeah. So how should things like that be communicated, right? Because you run into issues if you make mistakes. You run into issues if you sort of try to like paternalistically lie to the public, right? Like people start to sniff that out. You potentially run into issues by just like putting everything out there because it's too dense and it doesn't necessarily make sense to people. So how do you thread that needle?
I wish I knew the answer. I mean, I truly believe, maybe I'm naive, but I really think if you tell the truth as much as possible, in the end, most people are going to realize that you have a track record of telling the truth, and telling people what you believe is the truth at the time, and then changing that statement if you discover something new that presents evidence against what you believed before. And then I think that builds trust, and that's why most people believe a government body like the CDC, because throughout the history of time, for the most part, they've had nothing but the best interests of our country, and you could believe the results. Now, some stuff happened in the past 4 years where it eroded a lot of the trust in the CDC, right? And that was a big problem. I mean, honestly, that was, for me, something I was so upset about, is that erosion of trust in something that we should trust, like the CDC. So I don't know how you get it back. That's the scary thing. It's once you lose that trust, how do you build it back? I don't know. Yeah, I need someone else on the podcast to answer.
to solve that riddle.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's another aspect too, which is like that we have these large, institutions that do fail, right? That there are a lot of, especially if we look in the last year, if we, you mentioned the mask situation, which I agree with you in that sense. Where like, I think that the characterization of that as some sort of like malicious lie is off, right? Where it's like
ridiculous.
Yeah. At that time, we're talking about N95 masks, and like no one even, well, I don't know about no one, but people weren't considering. Yeah, people weren't considering aerosol transmission, right? They didn't think that was a likely mechanism for spread of COVID. And so the idea is like you save the N95s for medical workers who are in situations where they're intubating someone, where you actually can create aerosols. And if you know enough about the machinations of this stuff and like the types of considerations for medical workers, like that actually makes sense. That's not like an insane manipulative situation. But you have two things going on, right? It's like they were wrong at some level, because now we know, okay, aerosols are a thing. But then you also have the fact that they were wrong in a way that looks really bad, right? Yeah, so it's like they were wrong. It looks really bad, but it's not for the reason that you think. And that can create this like really bad loss of trust, which I think is extremely difficult to navigate.
And it was such an own goal. It was such a like shoot yourself in the foot. Because if they had just said, look, we have very limited N95 masks, we should preserve them for the people that need them in the absence of evidence that the rest of us, that it will help the rest of us.
Yeah.
That would have been so much better than saying masks don't work, right?
Yeah.
So it was an own goal. It was a big problem. But even given that it was an own goal, it was not a malicious, like you're saying, it was not meant to misinform the public. It was a misunderstanding of what we found out later was the case, which is aerosol transmission was a big problem, right? So yeah, I don't know. It's something I'm working on. It's something I care a lot about, is how to communicate health information to people in a way that they'll not just be able to understand, but believe, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
How do we build that trust? How do we get people to believe what we're saying is true?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting problem to not to keep dwelling on like the aerosol stuff, but I think that another type of failure mode there, right, is like a bureaucratic infighting in like an ossified institution that's overly cautious. You know, people don't know that there's been this ongoing debate about whether or not aerosol transmission is possible for respiratory diseases, and that some of the heads of some of these institutions like have an entrenched position on that, right? And it's okay, this is kind of like ossified bureaucratic infighting that's causing this problem, not like a manipulative, you know, like trying to get, yeah, right, you know, and it's so difficult to unwind that stuff. So I mean, I guess for you then, you know, what do you think is the way to communicate research, right, with like nuanced findings, tons of caveats, you know, maybe it's like this, but it could be reverse causation, and we tried to adjust, but like we don't really know. Like that's, people are like, yeah, who cares? Like, give me this Instagram influencer's fucking protein shake, man, get out of here with this. So what's your take on that?
I mean, well, you know, the podcast you mentioned is Epidemiology Counts, and everyone listening, you should go listen to it. I host that, and the reason we came up with it, thank you. The reason we came up with that podcast is to get at this exact question. You know, how can we have a deep dive into a topic and actually talk about it and all the nuance involved, without maybe the media, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? A lot of health journalists do an amazing job. Like they listen to scientists and they write this incredible report. And then an editor slaps a headline on that says something completely sensationalistic that isn't even in the article. And that's what people see, is just the headline. And then that's what they go with. Okay. So I'm not necessarily vilifying the science journalists. I'm more talking about like how media gets digested by people, right? So we want to go beyond the headlines in this podcast. Now, the problem there is it requires an hour of your time to sit down and listen to all of the different nuances, and you have to be interested in it. So I don't know. I think we need to develop more outlets, more ways to talk about health in a way that can convey the nuances and maybe not take too much background level of knowledge or education or even time to be able to digest. I would love to come up with a solution to how to do that. Unfortunately, disinformation is so much more contagious than actual information, and sensationalism is, you know, it just propagates, right? The more sensationalistic you are, the more people are going to spread that to other people, even if it has no basis in reality. And I don't know how to counter that.
Yeah. Well, I think there's also an element of people kind of like self-selecting into places where the information is like being given to them in a way that they are willing to hear it. Right. And so, yeah, maybe disinformation does spread more and is more contagious, let's call it. But that's amongst the population for whom, like, to whom
didn't want to believe it in the first place.
Yeah. Right. But there's still probably a lot of people, you know, that aren't engaging, that aren't the kind of like weird eggs on Twitter, you know, mobbing someone who posts something that they don't like or whatever. Right. But they're out there. They're maybe just not as vocal. So it's like tough to get the feedback then.
Yeah, totally true. I mean, you're right. And I guess what's really disappointing to me is that we used to have what's the word I'm looking for here? we used to have ways to judge whether a source was something you should trust or not. So I got trained at Johns Hopkins. Okay, that's where I did my PhD. I think like 10 years ago, if you said, "Oh, this person's got his PhD in epidemiology from Johns Hopkins," he probably knows what he's talking about in this. Maybe I should listen to him. But it's gotten to the point where like half of the people hearing me say that will say, "Oh God, he's an elitist." He's got. Why should I believe what he's saying? He's coming from this elite institution. They all want to push an agenda in a certain way. And it's gotten to the point where these gatekeepers, I guess is the word I was looking for, like these gatekeepers of knowledge, reasons to believe that you should believe someone. Or this is a journalist from the New York Times. It used to be, well, New York Times science section, that's something I should believe. Now it's that's an elite media or leftist rag. Why should I believe that person's reporting? So it's gotten to the point where these gatekeepers have gotten attacked in some ways for legitimate reasons. Like, don't get me wrong. I mean, just because you went to Harvard or something doesn't mean that everything you say is right. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just saying that it's hard for people to judge who they should believe anymore, right? And then in that vacuum, you start getting drawn to people that just believe the same things you do, right? If everyone's telling you don't believe these elites, don't believe this, don't believe that, then you're going to say, all right, well, I'm just going to believe what I like to believe. What's comfortable to me to believe because it aligns with what I believe, and you're not going to challenge, some of the things that you're thinking. And I don't know how to deal with that.
Yeah.
It's really difficult to me.
Totally. Well, and to your point about the New York Times, right? I mean, there was a recent situation a few months ago where like a rationalist blogger who I'm a fan of, right? And I attend some meetups in the Chicago Rationality group, right? They did like an expose on him that was like pretty disingenuous, right? And like very off base in a lot of ways. And I think a lot of people have situations like that where they see something in the mainstream media that they actually do kind of know about, and they're like, this is wrong. Wait, everything is wrong, right? Which like is at some level, that's a useful insight to have, right? Like the Gell-Mann effect, right? Like I think everyone has that where you're like, I actually know about this, and that's definitely not the case. But the correct response to that isn't necessarily, epistemic nihilism. Out. Yeah, right. It's a having a more nuanced take on like, okay, right. Let's weigh a few different sources or potentially understand like that people may have competing motives and that kind of thing.
Exactly. So the way I try to explain to people, what people ask me a lot about is how you deal with the fact, like the classic example in epidemiology is like, coffee's good for me 1 week and then the next week it's bad for me. And then another study comes out, it's good for me. And then it's bad. Like you guys keep changing your mind. Like what the hell is it? And the only thing I can tell people is like, you just trust that every time another major study comes out, they're building on the study that came before it, and you just kind of have to trust those sources, to be able to compile that information and give you the latest information about that topic and what we believe about it. And it evolves. Like I said, it changes over time. I mean, doctors used to smoke. Well, a lot of doctors still smoke, I should say, but like the majority of doctors smoked before we developed the clear evidence that it was really, really bad for you, right? That doesn't mean that, that you shouldn't trust doctors, right? It's just that our thinking on things have changed. And, you have to learn who to trust in the face of changing evidence. Who are the sources that you should trust?
Totally. So I have one more question for you that I want to get your take on. And actually the coffee thing kind of brought that to mind, right? So I think that from an outsider's perspective, it seems to me like epidemiology is like both overrated and underrated, right? In the sense that the news media will latch on to headlines like that, right? Like chocolate causes you to lose weight or whatever. And you're like, anyone who knows anything about like basic statistics can kind of like skim the abstract of the study and be like, come on, like what are you guys talking about? Right. Yeah. But then the flip side of that is that people have that experience a few times, or, start reading some blogs and they're like, like correlation is not causation, down with epidemiology. Like this is not this is not a randomized controlled trial. Like your observational work is trash. And so, I see like both of these things happening. And so to me, it seems like epidemiology is like not properly rated, let's say, right? So from your perspective, doing an epidemiology podcast, being in the field, how should people who are like reasonably plugged in, somewhat engaged, how should they think about like these types of sensational health studies or these kind of like hardcore evidence bros that don't seem to have like a great perspective on what's going on?
Right. Well, our very first episode we ever recorded for Epidemiology Counts is the one I think everyone should listen to, because we addressed this exact question of if a new health study comes out, I see an article about it, how do I know if I can trust it? Okay, so we kind of do a deep dive into that. And the main thing I'll tell you is go beyond the headline. Don't just read the headline, because it's going to be a simplified or sensationalistic distillation of what the study says. Okay, so actually read the study and then read if there are multiple media articles about it, read those. If you have time, read what the actual study says. Most scientific studies, I know they're written in language that only us weirdo scientists can understand, but they all have an abstract. And usually the abstract is written in a way that most people could be able to glean what the study is telling you. Okay, so read the abstract at least. Maybe listen to what the scientists are saying in their own words, if they're ever interviewed, about the findings. Okay, so you have to go beyond just that headline. All right, so and then just know that almost any good trained epidemiologist will hedge all of their bets. We're trained to never say, I'm 100% sure this causes this. You'll never hear us say that. I mean, it's literally part of the training. You have to sign something. That's actually not true. But like for the most part, like you would never say that this definitively causes that, right? You always are like, this is the evidence that we have. We try to control for as many reasons we would see this spuriously as we can, and this, to the best of our knowledge in the data set we have, we think that this causes this. Okay, if another study comes out that says it isn't, you have to compare the sample size of that study compared to this study. If this study has 10,000 people in it, another one comes along with 50 people in it, and they're like, actually, coffee's terrible for you. Well, I'm probably going to believe the one in 10,000 people, that's been followed for 20 years compared to the study of 50 people where they did 3 months of testing. So there's different ways to judge the quality of the data that go into it. I know that takes some training, but I think it's training that honestly most people could. You don't have to do a 5-year PhD program to get the basic understanding of how to rate the evidence from a study that you're looking at. Simple things like sample size, what they controlled for. If there's obvious things you could think of that would lead to seeing that and they didn't adjust for it, they didn't address it, then maybe you don't believe it, So you have to be able to openly look at something and be able to say, should I believe this or should I not? And the problem is so many people these days just go to, should I believe this based on who's saying it, right? Like who's telling me I should believe this? It's Fox News. Okay, I believe this, as opposed to like, did you actually look and see if you really believe this or not? Does this make sense? This is based on factual reality as you see it. That's something that people aren't doing as much anymore.
Did they ever though?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. I don't know. I don't know if it's just worse now because of social media and the internet, and everyone can just immediately go find an answer, right or wrong, to whatever question they have. So maybe it's always been like this. I actually have a theory that back when the only place you get information is from books, right? That it was way less likely you would get disinformation, right? Because someone had to spend a lot of time writing that book, someone's not going to write just some blog post about some completely falsifiable BS, so you're not going to find a book probably that hasn't been that someone hasn't, worked on really long to get, that conclusion. So you're much less likely to run into false information. Now that the internet's here, anyone can write anything, make it look official, and there you are, right?
I mean, I'd challenge your contention about the lack of false information in books, though. I don't know.
That's probably
maybe if we go back and look at like the Malleus Maleficarum or whatever, there's probably not a lot of like.
Yes. Okay, fair enough. And then we're not going to get too into this, but even the most famous book around probably has a lot of stuff that people take as fact that we could argue.
Yeah, might not be.
So you're totally right. But at least I guess you had less conflicting, right or wrong. I'll put it this way: whether it was wrong or not, you had less conflicting evidence, right? So you had more kind of consensus. Let's put it that way. Whether it was true or not, you had consensus about what the majority of people thought about a certain quote unquote fact, right? Now you can have 20 different versions of that same thing. Yeah, I don't know.
It's chaos.
It's
chaos out there.
It's total chaos. That's the conclusion here.
Yeah. So with that, we'll let people properly weight all the epidemiological information that they take in and updating their Bayesian priors and just start making great decisions. It's going to be fantastic. And the podcast is fantastic. I don't know when what your current release schedule is, but hopefully there's some more episodes coming out soon. And
we're trying to do it every month. We try to do it every month, but I'm pretty busy these days. But we're trying to get it every month. But we just did one on racialized policing, which is obviously a very, immediately a topic that is on all of our minds. So check that one out.
Yeah, it's a great podcast, great episode. So everyone should listen to that.